Peaceful nights in the wilderness can turn chaotic when immense predators strike without warning. Camps collapse, cabins splinter, and lives are upended in terrifying seconds. From a custom rifle test in Alaska to a police patrol ambush in Russia, the encounters grow deadlier and more shocking. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters that remain unforgettable. In the remote wilderness of Alaska, near the sprawling tundra valleys north of the Alaska Range, Alex Carter had spent 3 years preparing for a moment he knew would eventually arrive. The year was 2023, and the region had seen an unusual surge in grizzly bear activity, with reports flooding in from hunting guides about massive specimens roaming the river valleys in search of salmon runs. Indigenous hunters had frequented this particular stretch of wilderness for centuries, and its reputation for harboring colossal predators was well documented in local folklore. The terrain consisted of dense spruce forests, interspersed with open meadows where bears would congregate during the early autumn months, making it both a prime hunting ground and an exceptionally dangerous environment for anyone unprepared. Alex had always been meticulous about his equipment. Unlike many hunters who relied on factory rifles, he had decided to build his own dangerous game rifle from the ground up. He started with a precision-machined receiver and chambered it in .416 Rigby, a cartridge renowned for its ability to take down the largest and most dangerous animals on Earth. Every component was hand-fitted with painstaking attention to detail. The heavy 24-inch barrel was selected specifically for its ability to stabilize heavy bullets at moderate velocities, ensuring maximum penetration. He crafted a custom stock from laminated wood, choosing materials that could withstand the brutal recoil, while providing the necessary strength for harsh weather conditions. Pillar bedding was installed to guarantee consistent accuracy, and a tuned single-stage trigger allowed for crisp, predictable breaks when the moment of truth arrived. But Alex did not stop there. He hand-loaded his own ammunition, carefully selecting 400-grain soft-point bullets designed for controlled expansion upon impact. Each cartridge was weighed, measured, and tested to ensure consistency and accuracy. He spent countless hours at the range, adjusting powder charges and seating depths until he achieved the level of precision he demanded. His friends often joked that he treated his rifle like a surgeon treated a scalpel, but Alex understood that in the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness, there was no room for error. A poorly constructed rifle or inconsistent ammunition could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. When the hunting season finally arrived in September 2023, Alex traveled north with his guide, a grizzled veteran named Thomas Brennan, who had spent over 30 years navigating the treacherous terrain. Thomas had warned Alex that this particular region was home to some of the largest grizzlies he had ever encountered, with several bears exceeding 1,200 pounds in weight. The two men set up camp near a river valley known for its aggressive bear population, and they spent the first few days scouting the area, looking for fresh tracks and signs of recent activity. On the morning of September 17th, just as dawn began to break over the mountains, Alex and Thomas crouched low behind a rocky outcropping overlooking a clearing approximately 200 yards wide. The air was crisp and cold, with a light mist hanging over the valley floor. They had been waiting in silence for over an hour when movement caught their attention. A colossal grizzly emerged from the tree line on the far side of the clearing, its massive frame dwarfing the surrounding vegetation. Thomas estimated the bear to be easily 10 feet from nose to tail and pushing 1,300 pounds, one of the largest specimens he had seen in his career. The bear moved with surprising agility, despite its enormous size, flipping logs with casual strength and roaring aggressively at a group of ravens that had been pecking at a nearby carcass. Its fur was thick and dark, rippling over layers of muscle built from a summer of gorging on salmon and berries. Alex felt his pulse quicken as he watched the magnificent creature, knowing that this was exactly the kind of encounter he had been preparing for. Then the wind shifted. The bear froze mid-motion, its massive head swinging toward their position. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still as the predator locked eyes with the two men. Thomas whispered urgently that they needed to prepare for a charge, and his words were barely out of his mouth when the grizzly began moving toward them with terrifying speed. What had been a curious investigation quickly escalated into a full-blown charge, with the bear covering ground at an alarming rate. The earth seemed to tremble beneath its weight as it closed the distance, its roars echoing across the valley. Alex dropped to a prone position, bracing himself against his pack to stabilize the rifle. His years of training took over, and despite the adrenaline flooding his system, his breathing steadied. He could hear Thomas shouting behind him, urging him to take the shot, but Alex remained calm, waiting for the perfect moment. The bear was now less than 80 yards away and showing no signs of slowing down. Through his scope, Alex could see the raw power in every stride, the rippling muscles, the foam around its jaws. At 60 yards, Alex squeezed the trigger. The rifle thundered, and the recoil slammed into his shoulder with brutal force. The 400-grain bullet left the barrel at over 2,400 feet per second, covering the distance in a fraction of a second. It struck the charging grizzly squarely in the chest, smashing through muscle, bone, and vital organs with devastating efficiency. The bear's momentum carried it forward for several more yards, but its legs began to buckle. It crashed forward into the dirt, staggered once as if trying to regain its footing, and then went completely still before it could close the remaining distance. Silence returned to the valley. Alex remained in position for several long moments, his finger still resting near the trigger, ready for a follow-up shot that never became necessary. Thomas approached cautiously, confirming that the massive predator was indeed dead. The entire encounter had lasted less than 30 seconds from the moment the wind shifted to the final silence, but it felt like an eternity. Alex exhaled slowly, his hands steady despite the intensity of what had just transpired. Every painstaking hour he had invested in building that rifle, every meticulous adjustment to his ammunition, every practice session at the range had culminated in this one decisive moment in the Alaskan wilderness. He had proven that his craftsmanship and dedication could withstand the ultimate test when faced with one of nature's most dangerous predators. The remote wilderness surrounding Wrangell, Alaska, had been home to seasonal fishing cabins since the early 1900s, when prospectors and trappers established temporary shelters along the coastline. By 2025, many of these structures had been renovated into family vacation homes, although they remained isolated and accessible only by float plane or boat. The Reynolds family cabin sat approximately 12 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense Sitka spruce forest that provided ideal habitat for coastal brown bears and grizzlies. Michael Reynolds, 44, had inherited the cabin from his grandfather and spent weeks each summer maintaining the property with his wife Jennifer, 42, and their two children, Ethan, 15, and Hannah, 10. The family made annual pilgrimages to Alaska from their home in Portland, Oregon, cherishing the opportunity to disconnect from urban life and experience genuine wilderness living. September typically marked the end of tourist season in southeastern Alaska, with most vacation properties closing down before winter storms made travel dangerous. However, the Reynolds family had extended their 2025 visit by 2 weeks to take advantage of unusually mild weather and excellent salmon fishing conditions in nearby streams. On the evening of September 12th, Michael had been cleaning fish on the cabin's back porch, rinsing the carcasses and storing fillets in a cooler for the next day's meals. He had been careful to dispose of fish waste in sealed containers, knowing that improper food storage attracted bears. Still, the scent of fresh salmon had already permeated the area around the cabin. The family retired to bed around 10 o'clock, exhausted from a full day of hiking and fishing. Michael had secured the cabin's doors and windows as usual, though the old structure's weathered construction left numerous gaps where animals could detect food odors from inside. Around 2 o'clock in the morning on September 13th, the family was awakened by heavy footsteps on the front porch and the sound of something large sniffing around the doorframe. Michael initially assumed a curious deer or smaller bear was investigating the cabin. This common occurrence typically resolved itself when the animals determined that there was no easy access to food available. However, the sounds quickly escalated from cautious investigation to aggressive attempts at entry. Wood began splintering as something tremendously powerful started forcing its way through the front door. Michael shouted warnings and grabbed the nearest defensive object, a heavy wooden chair from the dining area, while Jennifer herded the children toward the back of the cabin. The front door exploded inward with a crash that sent splinters flying across the living room. A massive grizzly bear, easily weighing over 600 pounds, crashed through the opening and immediately focused on Michael as the nearest perceived threat. The bear's fur was matted and scarred, suggesting an older animal that had survived numerous confrontations throughout its life. Michael swung the chair at the approaching predator, hoping to intimidate it long enough for his family to escape through a rear window. However, the bear simply swatted the furniture aside and slammed into Michael with tremendous force, knocking him to the floor. The animal's jaws clamped onto his shoulder, tearing through his shirt and inflicting deep puncture wounds that would later require over 40 stitches. Jennifer screamed and tried to pull Hannah away from the chaos, but the bear's aggressive movement sent furniture crashing in all directions, blocking potential escape routes. The predator released Michael and turned toward Jennifer, slashing at her arms as she shielded her daughter. Deep claw wounds opened across both forearms, bleeding heavily and causing Jennifer to nearly lose her grip on Hannah. Ethan had been sleeping in a small loft area above the main room and was thrown from his bed when the bear knocked over a bookshelf positioned below the loft. The heavy wooden shelving unit crashed down, briefly pinning Ethan's legs and preventing him from moving to safety. The bear swiped at the fallen furniture, its claws passing within inches of Ethan's face. Michael, despite his shoulder injury, managed to grab a metal camping pot from the kitchen area and began banging it repeatedly while shouting at maximum volume. Jennifer joined in, using a flashlight to create disorienting light patterns aimed at the bear's eyes. The combined noise and confusion broke the bear's focus on attacking specific family members. Ethan freed himself from under the bookshelf with help from his mother, scrambling across overturned furniture to reach the relative safety of a corner behind the wood stove. All 4 family members continued making as much noise as possible, creating an environment so chaotic that the bear apparently decided the confrontation was no longer worth the effort. After what the family estimated was approximately 7 to 8 minutes of terror, though it felt considerably longer, the grizzly retreated through the destroyed front door and disappeared into the surrounding forest. The cabin's interior looked as if a tornado had passed through, with furniture overturned, supplies scattered, and blood marking multiple locations where family members had been injured. Michael immediately used the cabin's emergency satellite phone to contact Alaska State Troopers and request medical evacuation. A helicopter arrived approximately 90 minutes later, transporting all 4 family members to a hospital in Juneau, where their injuries could be properly assessed and treated. Michael required surgery to repair torn muscles in his shoulder and received treatment for potential infection from the bear's bite. Jennifer's arm lacerations required extensive stitching and physical therapy to restore the full range of motion. Ethan suffered a fractured ankle from the falling bookshelf and multiple contusions. Hannah, though physically unharmed beyond minor scratches, required counseling for trauma and persistent nightmares about the attack. Authorities and investigators from the Department of Fish and Game visited the cabin site 2 days after the incident. They discovered that a salmon processing area behind the structure had not been properly secured, with fish carcasses still visible in an uncovered container. The scent had likely attracted the grizzly, and the bear's food-conditioned behavior suggested it had previously obtained human food through similar bold approaches to occupied structures. Authorities warned other cabin owners in the region about the increased danger of bear encounters during the late season, when animals were actively feeding to prepare for winter hibernation. The Reynolds family chose not to return to their Alaska cabin, eventually selling the property to buyers willing to invest in bear-proof doors, windows, and food storage systems. All 4 family members reported lasting psychological effects from the encounter, with Michael developing acute anxiety about wilderness environments and Jennifer requiring medication to manage recurring nightmares about the attack. The Mountain View Cafe had operated in northern Vermont's Green Mountains since 1987, catering primarily to hikers and tourists exploring the region's extensive trail systems. Located approximately 8 miles from the nearest town, the cafe occupies a converted hunting lodge that has been modernized with commercial kitchen equipment while maintaining its rustic charm. The establishment's remote location and forest setting attracted visitors seeking authentic wilderness experiences, combined with the comfort of hot meals and freshly baked goods. Emma Hayes, 34, had purchased the cafe 3 years earlier after working as a chef in Boston's competitive restaurant scene. She had grown tired of urban pressures and sought the simpler lifestyle that Vermont's rural communities offered. The cafe employed a small staff during the peak summer months, but Emma personally handled most operations, taking pride in her homemade pastries and locally sourced ingredients. August 2019 saw record numbers of tourists in Vermont, with unseasonably warm weather encouraging extended visits to mountain regions that typically receive fewer visitors during hot periods. The cafe's outdoor patio had become particularly popular, allowing guests to enjoy meals while surrounded by towering maple and birch trees that provided natural shade and spectacular views. On August 9th, Emma had prepared an especially large batch of blueberry scones and apple turnovers to accommodate weekend hiking groups that had made reservations. The cafe's small patio featured 6 wooden tables, each capable of seating 4 guests, with a serving counter positioned near the main entrance, allowing Emma to monitor both indoor and outdoor dining areas. Around 11:30 in the morning, approximately 15 customers occupied various tables both inside and on the patio, enjoying late breakfasts before beginning afternoon hikes. Emma was carrying a tray loaded with fresh pastries toward a family seated on the terrace when she became aware of unusual movement at the forest edge, approximately 40 yards from the cafe. A large black bear, estimated at over 300 pounds, emerged from the tree line and immediately focused on the outdoor dining area. The bear's behavior suggested it had previous experience obtaining human food, as it showed no hesitation or caution, typical of wild animals encountering people. Emma barely had time to shout a warning before the bear broke into a charge directly toward the patio. The animal covered the distance in seconds, scattering chairs and small decorative planters as it burst onto the wooden deck. Emma dropped her tray and attempted to back away, but the bear lunged forward and knocked her to the ground with a powerful swipe of its front paw. The impact sent Emma sprawling across the deck, and the bear immediately pressed its attack, raking deep scratches across both her arms as she tried to protect her face and head. Blood began flowing from multiple lacerations, and Emma later reported that the pain was initially less noticeable than the overwhelming terror of being attacked by an animal whose jaws were uncomfortably close to her throat. Other customers erupted into chaos as the bear's aggressive entrance triggered panic throughout the dining area. Several people dove behind the cafe's indoor counter, while others ran toward the forest edge in the opposite direction from the attacking predator. Tables and chairs were knocked over in the scramble, and the family seated nearest Emma's position abandoned their children's stroller in their desperate flight to safety. The bear released Emma and began investigating overturned coolers and food crates that had been stored on the patio for convenience during the busy weekend period. The animal used its powerful claws to tear open a sealed container holding sandwich meats and cheeses, consuming the contents. At the same time, customers remained hidden or had fled the immediate area entirely. A group of 3 hikers who had been approaching the cafe from a nearby trailhead heard the screaming and arrived to find the bear actively feeding on scattered food while Emma lay bleeding on the deck. The hikers grabbed metal pots and pans from a storage shed near the cafe's entrance and began creating as much noise as possible, banging the cookware together and shouting at the bear. The coordinated disturbance unsettled the predator, which had been focused entirely on obtaining food rather than continuing to attack people. After several minutes of persistent noisemaking, the bear grabbed a final piece of meat and retreated toward the forest, moving at a casual pace that suggested it felt no particular urgency despite the human presence. Emma's injuries required immediate medical attention, but the cafe's remote location meant that emergency medical services would need at least 45 minutes to arrive. One of the hikers, who possessed wilderness first aid training, applied pressure bandages to Emma's arms. In contrast, others contacted emergency services using cell phones that had limited but functional coverage at the cafe's location. 3 other cafe customers sustained injuries during the chaotic scramble to escape the bear's rampage. An elderly man suffered a broken wrist after falling while attempting to climb over the serving counter. A teenage girl received a deep gash on her leg from broken glass when the bear knocked over a display case. A middle-aged woman sustained multiple bruises and a possible concussion after being knocked down by other fleeing customers. Emergency medical personnel arrived approximately 50 minutes after the initial attack and transported Emma and the 3 other injured customers to a regional hospital in Burlington. Emma's arm lacerations required over 60 stitches and several months of physical therapy to restore full function. The elderly man's broken wrist healed without complications, while the teenage girl's leg wound required plastic surgery to minimize scarring. Authorities investigated the incident. They determined that the attacking bear had likely been food conditioned through repeated successful raids on improperly secured garbage containers and outdoor food storage at various locations throughout the region. The bear was tracked and ultimately captured 3 days later, then relocated to a more remote area where human contact would be minimal. Authorities issued citations to the cafe for multiple violations of state regulations regarding outdoor food storage in areas where bears are active. Emma was required to install bear-proof containers and modify her patio operations to eliminate easy access to food that might attract future wildlife encounters. The Mountain View Cafe reopened 2 weeks after the attack, implementing enhanced safety protocols and reducing its outdoor seating capacity. However, customer traffic declined significantly as news of the bear attack spread throughout tourist communities. Emma sold the business 6 months later and returned to restaurant work in more urban environments, admitting that she had underestimated the legitimate dangers of operating a food service establishment in genuine wilderness settings. The Amur region of southeastern Russia had been sparsely populated since Cossack explorers established frontier outposts during the 17th century. By 2022, the area remained one of Russia's most remote territories, with small villages and police stations situated hundreds of kilometers apart, separated by dense taiga forest. The police outpost at Krasnopolye served approximately 2,000 residents scattered across a territory larger than many European countries. 5 officers rotated shifts to provide basic law enforcement services, respond to emergencies, and coordinate with regional authorities in Blagoveshchensk, the nearest significant city, located over 300 kilometers to the southwest. Ivan Petrov, 38, served as the outpost commander and had been stationed in the Amur region for 12 years. His colleagues included Sergei Mikhailov, 42, Dmitry Sokolov, 35, Alexei Romanov, 31, and Nikolai Belov, 29. All 5 officers possessed extensive experience dealing with wildlife conflicts, as bear encounters represented one of the most common emergencies requiring police response in the region. October typically marked the period when brown bears engaged in hyperphagia, consuming enormous quantities of food to prepare for winter hibernation. This behavioral change made bears more aggressive and willing to approach human settlements in search of easy calories, creating dangerous situations that often resulted in property damage or injury. On October 5, 2022, a local farmer contacted the Krasnopolye outpost to report that a large bear had been observed near his livestock corral for 3 consecutive nights. The farmer expressed concern that the bear might attack his cattle or sheep, potentially resulting in devastating economic losses for a family that relied entirely on animal husbandry for survival. All 5 officers responded to the call around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, driving their patrol vehicle along a rough dirt road that connected the outpost to surrounding farms. The journey required nearly an hour due to poor road conditions exacerbated by recent rainfall. Upon arriving at the farm, the officers discovered that the bear had already killed 2 sheep during the previous night, dragging the carcasses into the nearby forest, where it had partially consumed them. The farmer explained that he had attempted to secure his livestock in a reinforced barn, but the sheer number of animals made complete protection impossible with available resources. The officers decided to conduct a patrol of the immediate area surrounding the farm, hoping to locate the bear and either drive it away from the settlement or, if necessary, eliminate it as a threat to human safety. Russian wildlife regulations permitted the destruction of bears that demonstrated persistent aggressive behavior toward humans or repeatedly attacked livestock. Ivan, Sergei, and Dmitry moved toward the livestock corral to examine evidence of the previous night's attack. At the same time, Alexei and Nikolai remained near the patrol vehicle to monitor radio communications and maintain situational awareness of the surrounding area. The corral sat approximately 100 meters from the main farmhouse, bordered on three sides by dense forest that provided excellent cover for large predators. As the three senior officers approached the corral, examining torn fencing and blood trails, a massive brown bear burst from the tree line with shocking speed and aggression. The animal, later estimated to weigh over 700 pounds, had apparently been resting in thick undergrowth after feeding on the sheep carcasses and perceived the approaching humans as a threat to its food source. The bear covered the distance to the officers in seconds, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for an animal of its size. Ivan was struck first, the bear's momentum slamming him backward into a wooden fence post with tremendous force. The impact shattered several of Ivan's ribs and caused severe internal injuries that would prove fatal within minutes. Sergei attempted to draw his service pistol, but was unable to complete the action before the bear turned its attention toward him. The animal's claws tore through Sergei's uniform jacket and inflicted deep lacerations across his chest and abdomen. Sergei fell to the ground, bleeding heavily from multiple wounds that severed major blood vessels. Dmitry tried to retreat toward the farmhouse, but stumbled over debris from the damaged corral fencing. The bear seized this opportunity to attack, clamping its jaws onto Dmitry's leg and dragging him several meters before releasing him. The bite crushed bones and caused massive tissue damage that resulted in uncontrollable hemorrhaging. Alexei and Nikolai, who had been monitoring the situation from near the patrol vehicle, heard the screaming and immediately ran toward the corral. Both officers drew their weapons and fired multiple warning shots into the air, hoping to frighten the bear away from their injured colleagues. The gunfire initially seemed to have no effect, as the bear continued its assault on the three fallen officers. However, after Alexei and Nikolai fired additional shots that struck the ground near the animal, the bear finally broke off its attack and retreated into the forest, moving with the same frightening speed it had demonstrated during its initial charge. Alexei and Nikolai reached their colleagues and immediately began administering first aid. Still, the severity of the injuries made effective treatment impossible due to the limited medical supplies available in their patrol vehicle. Ivan had already lost consciousness and showed no signs of breathing. Sergei was conscious, but bleeding so heavily that basic pressure bandages proved inadequate. Dmitry remained alert, but was going into shock from blood loss and severe pain. The officers used their radio to request an emergency medical evacuation. Still, the remote location and limited helicopter resources in the region meant that professional medical assistance would take hours to reach the site. Alexei and Nikolai did everything possible to stabilize their colleagues, but all three victims continued to deteriorate rapidly. Ivan Petrov was pronounced dead at the scene when medical personnel finally arrived approximately 3 hours after the attack. Sergei Mikhailov died during emergency transport to Blagoveshchensk, his injuries simply too severe to survive despite the efforts of paramedics. Dmitry Sokolov lived for another 6 hours after reaching the regional hospital, but ultimately succumbed to massive blood loss and organ failure caused by his injuries. Alexei Romanov and Nikolai Belov were treated for deep lacerations and shock at the same hospital, their injuries occurring primarily during their attempts to assist their dying colleagues rather than from direct bear attacks. Both men required extensive counseling to deal with the trauma of witnessing their colleagues' deaths and their inability to prevent the tragedy. Regional authorities organized a search for the attacking bear, mobilizing experienced hunters and wildlife officials to track and eliminate the dangerous animal. The bear was located 2 days later, approximately 15 kilometers from the attack site, and was destroyed by rifle fire after it displayed aggressive behavior toward the tracking team. Investigation into the incident revealed that the farmer had been improperly disposing of livestock carcasses, leaving dead animals in accessible locations that attracted bears and conditioned them to associate human settlements with easy food. Authorities issued citations and required the farmer to implement proper carcass disposal procedures to prevent future conflicts with wildlife. The Krasnopoli police outpost was permanently closed 6 months after the attack, with remaining officers transferred to other assignments throughout the Amur region. The small building that had housed the facility was eventually converted into a storage shed, as no one wanted to staff a location associated with such a tragic incident. Kodiak Island, located in the Gulf of Alaska, approximately 30 miles from the Alaska Peninsula, is home to the world's largest subspecies of brown bears. The Kodiak bear population, estimated to be over 3,000 animals, had evolved in isolation for thousands of years, developing body sizes that could exceed 1,500 pounds in mature males. By 2024, the island remained largely undeveloped, with most of its 3,000 square miles consisting of wilderness managed for wildlife habitat and controlled hunting. Alex Bennett, 38, had been planning his Kodiak bear hunting expedition for over 3 years, saving money and preparing physically for the demanding conditions he would face in Alaska's remote terrain. He was accompanied by 2 close friends, Ryan Cooper, 31, and Matt Dawson, 29, both experienced hunters who had participated in numerous big game expeditions throughout North America. The 3 men had secured the necessary permits and hired an experienced local guide who operated a small hunting service based in the village of Karluk, is Kodiak's western shore. Their plan involved a week-long backpacking expedition through mountainous terrain, targeting mature male bears that wildlife biologists had identified as appropriate harvest candidates based on population management objectives. September represented prime hunting season on Kodiak, as bears were actively feeding on spawning salmon in the island's numerous streams and rivers. The combination of abundant food and predictable bear movements typically produced high success rates for hunters willing to endure the physical challenges of backcountry travel. On September 5th, the 3 hunters had been trekking through dense Sitka spruce forest for approximately 4 hours, following a ridgeline that overlooked several salmon-bearing streams. Their guide had remained at base camp to prepare equipment for the return journey, confident that the hunters possessed sufficient experience to operate safely without constant supervision. The hunters carried substantial food supplies in external frame backpacks, including freeze-dried meals, energy bars, and jerky. Additionally, they had successfully harvested a black-tailed deer the previous day and were carrying portions of the processed meat intended for that evening's dinner. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, as the hunters descended from the ridge toward a stream where their guide had reported seeing fresh bear sign, they became aware of a large Kodiak bear approximately 100 yards ahead. The animal appeared to be feeding on salmon carcasses along the stream bank, moving slowly and showing no immediate awareness of human presence. Alex raised his binoculars to assess the bear's size and trophy potential, determining that it was indeed a mature male that met their harvest criteria. However, before the hunters could formulate a stalking plan, the bear suddenly lifted its head and turned directly toward their position. Wildlife experts later theorized that wind conditions had shifted, carrying the hunters' scent along with the smell of their food supplies and the deer meat directly to the feeding bear. Kodiak bears possessed extremely sensitive noses, capable of detecting food sources from remarkable distances, and the combination of human scent plus concentrated food odors likely triggered an aggressive investigative response. The bear broke into a charge with terrifying speed, covering the distance between its initial position and the hunters far faster than any of them had anticipated possible for an animal weighing over 1,000 pounds. The ground trembled beneath its pounding footfalls as it closed the gap. Alex fired a warning shot over the bear's head, hoping to frighten the animal into breaking off its charge. However, the shot had no discernible effect, and the massive predator continued its advance without hesitation. The hunters began backing away while attempting to maintain formation, knowing that running would likely trigger an even more aggressive pursuit response. Ryan raised his rifle and fired a second shot that struck the ground several feet in front of the charging bear, kicking up dirt and creating a momentary distraction. However, the animal simply altered its angle of approach and continued moving toward the hunters. When the bear closed to within 20 yards, Alex decided to fire directly at the animal in self-defense. His shot struck the bear in the shoulder, but failed to penetrate deeply enough to stop the charge immediately. The wounded animal roared in pain and rage, accelerating its final approach. The bear slammed into Alex with tremendous force, knocking him completely off his feet and sending his rifle flying into nearby brush. The animal's weight pressed down on Alex's chest and torso, its claws raking deep gashes through his heavy jacket and the flesh beneath. Alex later reported that he could feel his ribs cracking under the pressure and experienced difficulty breathing as the bear's mass compressed his chest. Matt attempted to circle behind the bear to deliver a stopping shot, but his movement drew the animal's attention. The bear released Alex and spun toward Matt with shocking agility, its massive paw connecting with Matt's shoulder and sending him sprawling into a fallen spruce tree. The impact knocked Matt's rifle from his hands and left him momentarily stunned. Ryan fired 3 rapid shots at the bear from a distance of approximately 15 feet, aiming for the animal's vital organs. At least 2 rounds struck home, finally causing the bear to stagger and reconsider its aggressive behavior. The animal backed away from the hunters, blood visible on its fur, and retreated toward the stream where it had been feeding. The bear disappeared into thick alder brush along the stream bank, leaving the 3 hunters injured and shaken but alive. Alex's torso showed multiple deep lacerations that were bleeding heavily, and he suspected internal injuries based on the pain radiating from his ribcage. Matt's shoulder was dislocated from the bear's powerful swipe, and he had sustained a concussion when his head struck the fallen tree. Ryan, who the bear had not directly struck, immediately activated the group's emergency beacon to summon rescue services. He then began administering first aid to his companions, using supplies from their backpacks to control bleeding and stabilize injuries as best he could under field conditions. A rescue helicopter arrived approximately 90 minutes later, having been dispatched from Coast Guard facilities in Kodiak. The aircraft landed in a small clearing near the hunter's position, and paramedics provided advanced medical care before airlifting all 3 men to a hospital on the mainland. Alex required surgery to repair torn muscles and broken ribs, along with extensive stitching of his claw wounds. Matt's dislocated shoulder was reduced and immobilized, and his concussion required several days of observation. Ryan was treated for minor injuries sustained during the chaotic retreat from the attacking bear. Wildlife officials later located the wounded bear dead approximately 1 mile from the attack site, having succumbed to the gunshot wounds inflicted during the hunter's defensive shooting. Biologists determined that the animal was an older male, estimated to be 22 years of age, exhibiting signs of dental problems and previous injuries that may have made it more aggressive than typical Kodiak bears. Authorities concluded that the attack resulted from the hunters inadvertently approaching too close to a feeding bear while carrying strong food odors that triggered an aggressive territorial response. No citations were issued, as the hunters had acted appropriately in defending themselves once the charge began. All 3 men recovered from their physical injuries within several months, but reported lasting psychological effects from the encounter. None chose to participate in future Kodiak bear hunts, despite having invested years of planning and significant financial resources in the expedition. The Canadian Arctic archipelago spans nearly 1 million square miles of frozen wilderness, with research stations scattered throughout, conducting climate monitoring and wildlife studies that require constant helicopter supply missions. The Ellesmere Station operated year-round with 12 researchers and support personnel, located approximately 800 miles from the North Pole. March represented one of the most challenging months for operations, as temperatures remained dangerously cold, often dropping below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Mark Sullivan, 42, had been flying Arctic supply missions for over 15 years. His co-pilot for the March 18th supply run was Ethan Brooks, 34, who was building experience for primary pilot certification. Their helicopter departed from Resolute Bay around 8 o'clock in the morning, carrying supplies and fuel drums for Ellesmere Station. The flight required approximately 3 hours under normal conditions. The flight proceeded smoothly until it approached Ellesmere Station around 11:30. Mark radioed ahead and received clearance to land at the supply area 200 yards from the main building. As Mark brought the helicopter down, both pilots noticed a large polar bear approximately half a mile distant. Polar bear sightings occurred regularly near the station, and protocols required alertness but not alarm unless animals approached closely. Mark decided to inspect fuel drums from a previous delivery to verify they were secured against wind damage. Ethan remained in the aircraft to monitor communications and maintain engine idle. Mark exited and walked 50 yards to where orange fuel drums had been positioned near the landing zone. He spent several minutes examining connections and checking for wind damage. While Mark inspected the drums, the polar bear began moving toward the landing zone with increasing speed. Ethan noticed and immediately pounded on the window, shouting warnings, but the idling engine made it difficult for Mark to hear. By the time Mark became aware of the danger, the polar bear had closed to within 30 yards at full charge. Mark attempted to sprint back, but heavy clothing, uncertain footing on snow, and the predator's speed made escape impossible. The polar bear, estimated at over 800 pounds, slammed into Mark from behind, knocking him face first onto the frozen ground. The animal's jaws clamped onto Mark's torso, its canine teeth penetrating through protective clothing and inflicting catastrophic injuries to his chest and neck. Ethan continued screaming and pounding on the helicopter, helplessly watching as the pilot intervened. Station personnel heard the commotion and rushed toward the landing zone, but the distance and lack of weapons prevented them from reaching Mark in time. The incident lasted less than 2 minutes before Mark lost consciousness from massive blood loss. The polar bear remained with Mark's body for several minutes before station personnel approaching from multiple directions caused it to retreat across the tundra. Emergency responders reached Mark within 5 minutes, but found no signs of life. The severity of his injuries meant survival would have been impossible even with immediate advanced care. Ethan Brooks, who witnessed the entire attack from the helicopter, required sedation and was evacuated to southern facilities within hours. He never returned to Arctic aviation work, citing overwhelming trauma from his inability to prevent his colleague's death. Canadian wildlife officials determined the attacking polar bear was a mature female showing signs of malnutrition that likely contributed to its aggressive behavior. Climate change impacts on sea ice have been reducing polar bears' access to traditional seal hunting grounds, forcing some animals to approach human settlements in search of food. The bear was tracked and destroyed 3 days later, as its willingness to kill humans represented an unacceptable risk to station personnel. Ellesmere Station implemented enhanced security protocols following Mark's death, including mandatory armed escorts for outdoor work. However, complete protection from polar bear encounters remained impossible given the remote location. Ethan Brooks provided detailed testimony, emphasizing that Mark had followed standard protocols but could not outrun the charging bear. The investigation concluded that no negligence contributed to the tragedy, which was attributed to the unpredictability of wildlife behavior in Arctic environments where humans and polar bears occupied overlapping spaces.